On a warm California night in the summer of 2005, a mother of two jolted awake from a feverish dream. As she caught her breath and adjusted to the darkness of the bedroom, she gradually realized that she was soaked head to toe in sweat. She tried to wipe her face dry, but her arm felt too heavy to lift. Eventually she managed, but the exertion left her dizzy. Lying in bed, the woman tried to stay calm and get her bearings. She remembered feeling a bit fatigued at dinner the night before, but nothing extreme. Yet now she was delirious, achy, and could barely move. However, the woman did manage to nudge her husband awake and mumbled to him that she needed help. Seconds later, he had put a thermometer in her mouth and was anxiously waiting for it to beep. And when it did and he saw the number, his eyes went wide and he turned the thermometer around to show her. The woman's heart jumped. 104 degrees. Any higher than that and her life could be in danger. Then, the woman took a slow, deep breath and did one more thing. She raised her shirt and saw exactly what she dreaded. Her whole torso was covered in a thick red rash. The woman sank back into the pillows, her mind racing with fear. But she kept coming back to the same question. Why was this happening again? From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So, if you like today's story, the next time the follow button wraps up their Ironman triathlon race and just wants to take a hot shower, be sure to deplete their entire hot water supply right before. This episode is called The Nest. Just before Thanksgiving in November of 1987, 37-year-old Beth Sternlieb stopped to steady herself against a water fountain in a hospital hallway. A slim, strong woman with a bob of blonde hair, she was due to give birth to her second son very soon. The surges of pain were excruciating and growing stronger. Beth's husband, Greg, helped her shuffle along the corridor, trying to distract her in conversation. But the spasms she was experiencing were too intense to ignore. Beth's career as a yoga and meditation teacher at the nearby University of California at Los Angeles had taught her lots of strategies for coping with pain. But childbirth was testing her limits. Greg stroked Beth's hand and suggested she picture a perfect day with their whole family at a beautiful beach in Malibu or maybe a scenic hike in the hills. Beth relaxed a little while visualizing each scene until one powerful contraction scrambled her thoughts. It was so strong, she knew it could only mean one thing. Before she even realized what was happening, Beth was being eased into a wheelchair as Greg and a nurse rushed her down the hall. Everything was a blur of fluorescent lights and gleaming hallway floors until they were pushing through swinging doors into a delivery room. Hours later, drenched in sweat and her muscles aching from furious pushing, Beth suddenly heard the most magical sound, her baby crying. When the doctor finally placed the bundled-up tiny pink infant onto her chest, Beth gazed down at his sweet little face and smiled. All the pain and all the effort had been worth it, and now she was just looking forward to getting some rest. But a couple of weeks later, as Beth slumped in a chair in her doctor's office, she somehow felt even worse than right after delivering her baby. After the birth of her first child a few years ago, Beth had experienced typical postpartum aches and pains, but this time was different. Her primary physician, Dr. Shay Mitchell, listened intently as Beth told him what was going on. For a few days now, her head had throbbed with a dull, deep pain, her muscles ached, and her bowels had been churning. Her entire biological system felt under attack from top to bottom. No matter how many naps she took or how healthy a diet she ate, Beth felt wrecked. Dr. Mitchell nodded as Beth described what she'd been going through. Afterwards, he reviewed her medical chart and the vitals his nurse had taken when Beth first arrived. Then he took a seat on a stool facing Beth and told her not to worry too much. Her recovery from the pregnancy was actually proceeding at a healthy rate. However, he said that, this winter had been one of the worst flu seasons in Los Angeles that Dr. Mitchell had ever seen. So more than likely, Beth had just caught a bug that was a bit more stubborn than usual. And so he advised her to rest as much as she could and to drink lots of fluids. This was traditional advice, but hydration and rest would boost her body's strength to fight off whatever infection was causing her symptoms. If she stuck to this regimen for a while, Dr. Mitchell felt sure that Beth would soon be on the mend. Back at home, Beth told her husband that according to Dr. Mitchell, she very likely had the flu. Greg thought that made sense and offered to cover as much extra childcare as necessary to help his wife get back on her feet. Later that day, once the baby was down for a nap, Greg took their toddler out for a walk in the winter sun, while Beth retreated to the bedroom, closed the curtains, and crawled under the covers. When she woke up a couple of hours later to the sound of Greg and their toddler laughing in the front yard, she already felt better. Beth felt confident that her body would find its way back to health. It just needed time. But one afternoon, 6 months later, after a long shift at the UCLA Meditation Center, Beth felt unusually drained and went to rest in her office. Her postpartum flu-like sickness was long gone, but she'd been feeling run down the past couple of days. Around mid-morning, a headache had crept in and never left. By mid-afternoon, her body felt sore and limp, and she couldn't focus. Sitting in her office chair, Beth rested her head on the desk and rubbed her stomach, trying her best to ease the pain in her gut. As she did, she lifted her shirt and noticed something. A scattering of tiny dots all over her torso. Fortunately, they didn't itch or sting, but they were odd and new, which worried her. Later that night, Beth checked her stomach again before getting into the shower. And to her shock, the dots had multiplied and spread. Now her entire stomach was a solid block of red, like a really bad sunburn. Beth decided it was definitely time to make another appointment with Dr. Mitchell. A few days later, on a hot summer morning, Greg took the morning off of work to watch the baby while Beth went to the clinic. She felt woozy and bleached out by the sun as she crossed the parking lot and marched up the front steps into the building. Once inside of Dr. Mitchell's office, Beth raised her shirt to show him the thick red splotch across her stomach. And under the fluorescent lights, they looked even more severe. Dr. Mitchell studied the rash's texture and traced the tendrils to where it had spread the farthest. After a few moments, he stood back and shook his head. He admitted that he wasn't sure what it was, but his guess was some type of hives, which are usually caused by an allergic reaction. Beth didn't have any specific allergies that she knew of, but Dr. Mitchell told her that allergies can start any time in a person's life, for all sorts of reasons. Dr. Mitchell also said it was possible that Beth might have an autoimmune disease like psoriasis, which can cause severe rashes. He explained that autoimmune diseases are basically like the body having an allergic reaction to itself. Dr. Mitchell wrote down the name and number of a colleague who specialized in autoimmune disorders and gave it to Beth. If anybody could find out what was going on with her skin, it would be him. But unfortunately, it wasn't that simple. Early the next week, Beth made an appointment with the doctor, had blood drawn for multiple tests, then waited several days for a response. But when the call finally came, the doctor had disappointing news. All the tests were inconclusive. He told Beth that her results suggested the presence of some sort of autoimmune disorder, but there was not enough data to determine anything more specific. Beth felt frustrated and tired of this runaround with her health, but the red rash on her stomach had faded, along with the rest of her symptoms. So Beth shrugged it off and refocused on her work and family. Her baby and toddler were growing up quickly, and she wanted to savor every day of it. One spring morning, about 4 years later, Beth's bedroom door burst open as both her kids tumbled onto the bed, hungry for breakfast. Her oldest was in elementary school, and her youngest was almost in kindergarten. Greg play wrestled with both of them as Beth slipped out of bed and went into the kitchen to start the coffee. But as she did, she noticed her head felt hazy. Last night, Greg had arranged a dinner party to celebrate Beth's return from a work trip, so they had stayed up late drinking wine and socializing. Now she felt like she was paying for it. As the coffee brewed, Beth rubbed her temples and pictured the long, busy workday ahead of her. Her kids seemed to have more energy every day, so juggling motherhood with a full-time job was not getting any easier. and having a slight hangover made it even worse. After feeding the kids breakfast, Beth got dressed and went to the bathroom to freshen up. Standing in front of the mirror, something familiar caught her eye. A rash of tiny red dots across her stomach. Beth's heart sank. The rash and the accompanying sickness came back a few times every year. But it had been about 6 months since the last time, so Beth had hoped that this time it might be gone for good. Later that morning, Beth was in the middle of a meditation class when her stomach lurched. She told her students to continue without her, and then she rushed to the bathroom. That day, all her familiar symptoms returned: the headache, the muscular pains, and the cramps. As she drove home through rush hour traffic after work, Beth felt overwhelmed and defeated. All her life, she had considered herself blessed to be a naturally healthy person. But something had changed after her second pregnancy. She still didn't understand what it was, but it was clear that this sickness, whatever it was, wasn't going away anytime soon. That night after dinner, Beth discussed the situation with Greg. She admitted that she had been feeling spread thin lately. The kids required so much energy, and her work had been tougher this semester. But, even so, Beth was confused how stress alone could be responsible for her recurring symptoms. Feeling generally run down was totally normal for any working parent, but pounding headaches and diarrhea and mysterious rashes were not. While Greg washed the dishes, Beth went to their bedroom to meditate. Sitting in the lotus position on her yoga mat with candles lit, Beth tried to block out stressful thoughts. She focused on breathing evenly, letting her body settle into a sense of calm. But worries kept nagging her, that these symptoms would keep coming back forever, and they would get worse as she got older, and maybe one day she'd be too weak and tired to fight them off. Beth gave up on meditation, opened her eyes, blew out the candles, and climbed into bed. Greg came in later and sat next to her. He suggested that Beth call in sick tomorrow and spend the day looking for new doctors. There had to be some medical professional out there who could figure out what was going on with her. Beth was grateful to have such a supportive partner and agreed to Greg's suggestion. But the next day started a trend that would go on for years. Calling various clinics, talking to all sorts of doctors, taking tests, and waiting for results. Yet nobody was able to determine what was causing her symptoms, so her symptoms just kept on returning. Every 5 or 6 months, the illness would return and knock Beth out for a week and then subside. Gradually, Beth learned to coexist with it. She had no other choice. Then came the summer of 2005. One hot day in late August of that year, Beth crouched in the living room surrounded by boxes, helping her son finish packing for college. It felt joyous and surreal, but also sad. Her youngest was now 18 and leaving the next morning to move into his freshman dorm. Beth had intended to go with him and help him get settled, but she'd woken up with an intense fever a few days ago and still felt too weak to make the drive. Her rash had also returned, this time worse than ever, covering her entire torso and up her neck. But it was the fever that really worried her. It had spiked a few times at 104. Beth tossed and turned through the nights, drenched in sweat. During the days, she felt too sick and exhausted to eat and fought to keep her eyes open. She had not been to work even once this week. Beth did visit her most recent doctor, who ran some tests and discovered that her white blood cell count was high, proving she had an infection of some sort. But, as always, he still had no answers as to what was making her sick. Once the boxes were all packed and taped, her son left to go meet up with some friends, and as soon as the door closed, Beth felt her body shut down. She always tried to put on a brave face in front of her kids, but inside, she was losing it. Beth had been battling this sickness for 18 long years. No matter how much she took care of herself or how proactive she was about seeing doctors, nothing had improved. Every 6 months, it came back like clockwork, and now it had returned with a vengeance. Her husband tried to stay optimistic, but she could tell he was beaten down by this too. This was not the life they had imagined together years ago when they started a family. Beth went to the bedroom, drew the blinds, and buried herself in the covers. She tried once again to rest and unwind, but she was getting tired of pretending that things would change. At the back of her mind lurked a dark thought. Was she doomed to live like this forever? 5 months later, Beth was lying on her back in a hospital room, waiting to be slid inside the big white donut of a CT scan machine. The past few months had been Beth's worst yet. Her fatigue had intensified to the point that she had to arrange an indefinite leave of absence from work. Beth's job was her passion, and without it, she fell into a depression, spending entire days in bed or on the couch. She barely ate or left the house. Over a couple of months of this gloomy routine, Beth lost 15 pounds, which only made her weaker. But, despite all this, Beth was still a fighter. She hadn't given up hope of finding someone who could help. Her latest doctor, Dr. William Bruce, specialized in infectious diseases, and over the past month, he tested Beth for a number of possible causes for her sickness, including malaria, parasitic infections, autoimmune diseases, and even HIV and hepatitis. One by one, they were all ruled out. So now, Dr. Bruce had ordered a CT scan to see if Beth might have some sort of internal injury or intrusive growth. Once the CT scan machine was prepared, a nurse slid Beth into the center cavity and then left the room. Beth lay there and listened to the mechanical hum, letting her mind wander. She had been through too much at this point to let her hopes rise very high, but a part of her stayed optimistic. About 15 minutes later, the machine powered down and the nurse returned and wheeled Beth out. A few minutes after that, Dr. Bruce entered and told Beth he would call her with the results as soon as they were ready, most likely in a day or two. The next 48 hours seemed to crawl by until finally, early one afternoon, while Beth sat on the couch under a blanket, her phone rang. It was the hospital. Her CT scan results had come in. Beth listened tensely as a nurse explained that the doctor had discovered 8 fibroids in her uterus. Now, by itself, that was not so shocking. Small uterine fibroids are common in women over 40, and they're very rarely cancerous. But one of Beth's fibroids was abnormally large, which could spell trouble. Fibroids tend to swell when they lose their blood supply and begin to die, which can lead to complications. The hospital gave Beth the phone number of a gynecologist, Dr. Jessica Schneider. They recommended that she call Dr. Schneider first thing in the morning to treat the issue. Beth promised she would, hung up, and went to tell her husband. Beth wasn't sure what to make of all this news yet, but she couldn't help but feel optimistic about the discovery. Was this really it? Was this the source of 18 years of sickness? Later that week, Dr. Jessica Schneider sat across from Beth in her office and told her she would need surgery. Beth nodded slowly with a look of resignation, like she'd somehow been expecting this. This was Dr. Schneider's third consultation with Beth. Over the course of their meetings, she had grown fond of her patient. Despite Beth's soft-spoken manner, she was clearly tough and resilient. Even so, this illness had obviously taken a toll. Beth's warm smile looked tired, and her eyes were ringed with dark circles. Dr. Schneider didn't want to add to Beth's struggles, but she knew surgery was a must. Over her years as a gynecologist, she had encountered fibroids many times and knew what to watch out for. When fibroids die, they often get big very quickly, and there was always a chance that any of Beth's fibroids could be cancerous. Dr. Schneider booked Beth's surgery for a couple weeks away in December and warned Beth that it was possible the fibroids were not the cause of all her sickness. If so, the surgery wouldn't change anything, but it was worth a shot. After the surgery, once Beth was stitched up and wheeled out of the operating room, Dr. Schneider scooted her stool in front of a stainless steel surgical tray and looked down upon the largest fibroid she had ever seen in her career. It was about the size of a grapefruit, 4 inches across. Dr. Schneider shook her head in shock as she thought of Beth carrying that enormous thing around inside of her. Poking it with her surgical ruler, Dr. Schneider was surprised by the fibroid's consistency. Normally, fibroids are dense, like little balls of muscle. This one was strangely springy and swollen. Dr. Schneider picked up a scalpel from her surgeon's toolkit and gently pressed the blade into the flesh of the fibroid. As soon as the tip pierced the skin, white pus exploded onto her hand. Slicing deeper, Dr. Schneider could not believe what she was seeing. The fibroid was like a rotten dumpling, filled to the brim with infected liquid. In all her years of study and practice, Dr. Schneider had never seen or heard of a fibroid like this. She quickly placed it in a sterile container and then hurried to have it tested by the lab. Dr. Schneider didn't know for sure, but every medical instinct in her body pointed the same direction. Whatever it was in this giant fibroid had to be the thing that had been making Beth sick. Days later, Dr. Schneider's phone rang with the report she had been waiting for, and with it, the explanation for Beth's long illness. Beth's fibroid was not cancerous, but it had been incredibly bad for her. The pus inside of Beth's fibroid was absolutely teeming with an unidentified strain of Salmonella bacteria. And, as far as the lab could tell, this Salmonella had been festering inside of Beth for a long time, possibly as far back as 1987, when Beth gave birth to her second child. For 18 years, Beth had been suffering from a simmering Salmonella infection that sometimes boiled over and caused her terrible cramps, rashes, and all the other debilitating symptoms. With the source of the infection removed, Beth's body could finally recover. Now, only one final question remained. How had she contracted the bacteria? Several months later, Beth was at home when there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find a public health nurse bearing unusual news. The hospital had kept testing the Salmonella from Beth's fibroid, searching for a match, until they finally found one. Hers was not the Salmonella commonly found in contaminated or undercooked food, but instead was a Salmonella strain only found in reptiles. Beth was blown away. Her kids had never once owned a pet reptile, and as far as she knew, there had never been a reptile in their house before. She had no idea how anyone in her family would have even been around one. Though Beth never got an official explanation for how she caught this reptilian strain of Salmonella, her doctor suspected that she contracted it while in the hospital for the birth of her second child. All it would have taken is one employee or patient with a pet turtle or frog or lizard who didn't properly wash their hands to touch something that Beth later touched as well: a doorknob, a railing, a water fountain. After that, the disease took shelter in a uterine fibroid where it would periodically escape into her bloodstream, causing her repeated bouts of illness. After her surgery, Beth never suffered from another episode of her terrible rash or other symptoms ever again. She returned to teaching mindfulness and yoga full-time with a deeper appreciation for health than ever before. On the afternoon of May 11th, 2015, 55-year-old Natalia was gathering sap inside of a Russian forest with her 82-year-old friend Valia. The two of them had been coming to this grove of birch trees for many years. They enjoyed the peace and solitude of nature, and it was also a good place for Natalia to bring her little dog so he could run around while they collected the sap. It was a perfect spring day. The weather was very mild, the sun was out, and the two friends had a great time just kind of moving around to the different birch trees, using their little drills and hammers to get their taps into the tree, and then they'd put their glass bottles underneath each tap to collect their harvest. And then at some point, Natalia felt like she had all the sap she would need, and she began gathering up her things to get ready to leave. And as she did that, she looked over at Valia, and she had found this really big birch tree, and she had sat down underneath it and was working hard to set her tap. And so as Natalia registered that Valia was over here, kind of doing one more tree before they left, she began looking around for her dog. And she found her dog, and he wasn't too far away from Valia, and he was just kind of moseying around one of the trees, when suddenly Natalia noticed the dog came to a hard stop, and it turned and looked deeper into the forest, like it had clearly registered something that had put it on alert that was out of view. And so Natalia, her view was obscured from whatever the dog was looking at, and so she put down her equipment and kind of moved between the trees to see what her dog was looking at. And at some point, her view cleared, and she saw pretty far off in the forest was something huge, this dark thing kind of moving behind the trees. And suddenly, it jumped out from behind the trees and ran towards the dog. It was a huge Russian brown bear. And so totally horrified, Natalia's watching this bear charge her dog. She looks over, she sees Valia, who's pretty hard of hearing, is sitting with her back to this bear and the dog, still just working on this tree. And Natalia's just frozen for a moment, having no idea what to do. And then instinct suddenly took over, and Natalia just turned and began running away, leaving Valia and leaving the dog. But after only running several paces, she stopped and turned around and saw the bear is still trying to attack the dog, but the dog is standing its ground and barking at the bear, which is kind of causing it to back up and be a little unsure of itself, even though this dog is so much smaller. And still Valia is not reacting at all. She has not heard the bear or the dog, nothing. And Natalia, she's looking back knowing that she needs to do something. She can't just let her friend and her dog get killed. And so Natalia began walking slowly back in the direction of this bear, and she began screaming at Valia to get up and run with her. But the second Natalia began screaming, the bear went from looking at the dog to turning and looking at Natalia, and suddenly it was like the dog meant nothing. The bear had decided it was going to go after Natalia. And so Natalia, she's staring at this bear, realizing, oh my God, it's going to charge me. But before she could even turn to run, the bear had ran at full speed and jumped at her. Natalia turned and she tried to run, but the bear bit down on her thigh, and she felt it crush her leg and pull her to the ground and whip her up against a nearby birch tree. And she's screaming and trying to pull herself away, but the bear is ripping at her leg, trying to yank her back into the forest. And then Natalia, she sees her little drill that she uses to set the tap in the trees, and she reaches out and she grabs it, and she turns, and her leg is being actively eaten by this bear. And she turns on the drill and she's about to jam it into the bear's eye when the bear suddenly stands up to its full height and then just falls all its weight down onto Natalia's chest. And immediately Natalia dropped the drill and the bear clenched down on her throat. Now, at this point, Valia, who again is hard of hearing, she didn't know what was going on, she turned around and saw this bear mauling her friend. And so what does she do? She runs over to this bear right behind it and begins pummeling this bear and screaming at it to get off her friend. And the bear, who barely registers Valia hitting it, it just lets go of Natalia for a second. It turns around, and you got to remember, this bear has been eating Natalia. Its face is covered in her blood. And it turns and looks at Valia, and Valia, she's terrified, she begins stumbling backwards, and the bear is clearly about to jump on Valia when Natalia, who's barely alive, she sees this happening, and she just begins screaming at this bear while she's laying there bleeding out, trying to attract the bear to come back and keep eating her to spare Valia. And it works. The bear, hearing Natalia screaming behind it, forgets about Valia and turns back around and resumes eating Natalia. And then just seconds later, the bear actually lifted up Natalia by her neck and it ran off into the woods carrying her. And so Valia is just left watching this happen. She knows she's not going to be able to stop this bear. And so she just begins running back towards the car, which was not that far from where they were. And when she got out there, she grabbed her phone and she called the authorities. About an hour and a half later, hunters sent by the police, along with animal control, arrived at this parking lot and they found Valia, who was totally in shock. And she would tell the hunters and animal control where this birch tree grove was, where all this happened. And a moment later, the authorities headed into the woods. And after arriving at the birch tree grove, they actually saw the bear. It was by itself, and it turned and looked at them, and it began charging them. And they all raised their rifles and they fired at the bear. And they shot it enough times that the bear collapsed right in front of them, and then they shot it one more time to make sure the bear was dead. But there was no sign of Natalia anywhere. But then suddenly, the authorities turned and saw something move off in the distance, and out from behind a tree came Natalia's little dog. It had somehow not sustained any injuries from this bear, even though the bear had originally gone after the dog. And the dog, it came up to the authorities and then quickly doubled back behind a tree. And so kind of operating on instinct, the group followed the dog around the tree, and they saw the dog was closely guarding this kind of mound that was covered in sticks and leaves and dirt. And so one of the hunters walked over and looked down, and they realized there was a person underneath this mound. It was Natalia. They pulled off all of the dirt and the twigs, and they found her absolutely destroyed, mauled body. But Natalia was actually still alive.
brown bears are notorious for eating their prey while they are still alive. And in many cases, they will gravely wound their prey, but not let it die, because then the meat is fresher when they come back and eat it later. And so bears will wound their prey and then basically bury them, cover them up with sticks and dirt, kind of like putting it in the fridge, and then come back and eat them later on. And so Natalia was earmarked to be eaten later because she was still alive and buried. Natalia was rushed out of the forest to a nearby hospital, and she would stay there for several weeks because she had serious injuries from this bear. All over her body were these huge bite marks, and a lot of the flesh from her leg had been pulled off. But amazingly, she would recover, although the trauma of nearly being eaten by a bear has never left her.
Our next story is called Grizzly Man. Known as the Grizzly Man, Timothy Treadwell was above all else a huge bear enthusiast. His passion for these creatures led to a passion for environmentalism and for documentary filmmaking, the subject of which were the grizzly bears of Katmai National Park in Alaska. And so starting in the late 1980s, Treadwell began going to Katmai National Park and setting up a camp there for the whole summer and filming all of his interactions with the grizzly bears. During the first half of the summer, Treadwell would stay in an area that he referred to as the Grizzly Sanctuary. It was this area near Hallow Bay. It was this big, open, green field. And all the grizzly bears seemed to just converge on this one area and kind of mosey around and be lazy. They were not aggressive at all towards Treadwell, and so he could walk up fairly close to them and just shoot great footage of these huge animals. During the second half of the summer, he would leave the Grizzly Sanctuary and go south to an area called Kaflia Bay. Then it was a much more densely forested area with lots of grizzly bear trails. Treadwell could use vegetation to get right up close to some of these bears without them necessarily seeing him. He referred to this area as the Grizzly Maze. Treadwell developed a fairly bad reputation amongst the park rangers of Katmai National Park because he was pretty reckless about how he interacted with these animals. I mean, they are big, wild predators, and he would get right up close and in their personal space, and every time he was just rolling the dice because eventually they thought something bad was going to happen to him. Treadwell believed he was taking every precaution and that what he was doing was safe. But Treadwell had become very emotionally connected to the grizzly bears he was seeing at Katmai National Park. He felt so comfortable with them that he would actually walk up sometimes and pet and goof around with the bear cubs. And for whatever reason, the grizzly bear parents would not harm him. And so he felt like he was kind of one of them, and they respected him and they welcomed him into their environment. Normally, whenever Treadwell went to Alaska for the summer, he would go alone. It was just him and his camera. But at the end of the summer, in October 2003, when normally Timothy would leave Alaska because October is the time when the grizzlies become more aggressive because they're trying to eat as much food as they can before going into hibernation, Timothy decides that instead of leaving, he's going to extend his stay one more week, and he's going to fly his girlfriend, Amy Huguenard, into Alaska to spend that week with him. Friends and family did not think this was a good idea, but Timothy was like, nope, it's going to be just fine. I know these animals better than anybody else. They are not going to hurt us. So he flies Amy in, and they set up camp along a grizzly trail inside of the Grizzly Maze. Neither of them were carrying a weapon or bear repellent spray. A week later, when the pilot returned to pick up Timothy and Amy, he looked up the hill and he could clearly see their campsite was not broken down. They had not packed it up yet. They were not down at the shoreline. So he gets out of his plane and he starts walking up the hill towards their campsite, thinking maybe they lost track of time. Maybe they don't know they're getting picked up today. And as he crests the hill, he sees there is a huge grizzly bear pacing around as if guarding its prey in the middle of this campsite. The grizzly sees the pilot and makes a move as if he's going to run towards him. The pilot turns, runs back to his plane, and flies out of there. And he calls park rangers and alerts them to this grizzly bear that's in the middle of Timothy and Amy's campsite. When the park rangers finally arrived and made their way up to the campsite, they could tell right away that Timothy and Amy were deceased. Their remains were scattered all around this campsite. It was clear that a grizzly bear or more than one grizzly bear had absolutely ripped them to pieces. However, this wasn't even the most horrifying part of this discovery. As the bodies were being taken away, the park rangers began bundling up their stuff to take with them, and they found inside the tent a camera that had a 6-minute tape on it. At first, when they hit play, they thought it was a blank tape, but it wasn't. It was just inside the tent when it was recording, and so it had no visual, but then they started hearing audio. And for 6 agonizing minutes with a blank screen, they heard crystal clear audio of Timothy and Amy being eaten alive by a grizzly bear. The audio suggests that Treadwell had left their tent because they heard a bear outside and was attacked. And he starts screaming for Amy to come outside. The bear has Timothy's head in its jaws, and Timothy is screaming, "It's killing me, it's killing me." And Amy is screaming back, "Play dead." And at some point, it's clear that's not working. They have no way to fight the animal. And Timothy starts yelling for Amy to run away. She's paralyzed with fear. She's screaming at the top of her lungs. And then Timothy is groaning and screaming, and eventually it stops when he drags Timothy away. And then Amy doesn't try to run away. She's just kind of frozen in terror. And you hear the bear come back, and then her screams pick up, and then the tape goes quiet. The next and final story of today's episode is called Exposure. Saturday, April 25th, 1987, was a beautiful spring day in the mountains of northwest Montana. It was exactly the kind of day that 40-year-old Charles Gibbs and his wife Glenda had been waiting for months. The sky was clear, the sun was bright, and the breeze was warm. And so, at around 9 a.m. that morning, Charles and Glenda had a quick breakfast inside of their house in the rural city of Libby, and then they started stuffing their backpacks full of their hiking equipment. Charles and Glenda were going to go to Glacier National Park, which is a 1 million acre wilderness preserve with alpine meadows, forests, rivers, and lakes that are so bright and crystal blue, they almost look like they're glowing. The park is ringed by snow-covered mountains, and it's dotted with glaciers, which are huge masses of pure ice that jut up out of the rock and make you feel like you've stumbled onto some ancient frozen planet. The park is actually so otherworldly that when Hollywood producers were looking for a location to shoot the heaven scene in the big movie What Dreams May Come, they chose Glacier National Park as their location. And for Charles and Glenda, this place practically was heaven. It was the place they went all the time to go hiking, especially on beautiful sunny spring days. After packing all of their gear, Charles and Glenda made their way out the front door and began heading to their car, when as they were walking, Charles suddenly stopped short, shook his head, turned around, and ran back inside the house. When he came back out again, he was carrying his camera bag, and so he ran over to the car, he sat down in the driver's seat, and he grinned at his wife, and he held up the bag, and he said, "Now we're ready." Both Charles and Glenda worked for the public schools in Libby. Glenda was an elementary school teacher, and Charles drove a school bus. But like a lot of people who lived in Montana, their real passion was the outdoors. And for Charles specifically, his real passion was wildlife photography. He was actually a pretty accomplished amateur photographer. He'd had a couple of photo exhibits locally, and he'd gotten a few of his pictures published in the local newspaper. But what Charles really wanted to do with his photography was get one of his wildlife pictures published in a weekly publication called the Hungry Horse News. The Hungry Horse News was a tiny publication, but they had won a Pulitzer Prize, which is the highest award for American journalism. And the Hungry Horse News was famous for its nature photography. Charles had been submitting his work for years to the Hungry Horse News, but the editor kept rejecting them, telling Charles that his photos were totally beautiful, but they weren't dynamic enough. Nothing was happening in these photos. And so that morning, on the couple's drive to Glacier National Park,
Charles began talking out loud to Glenda about what strategy he was going to use for his photographs during their hike. What route they were going to be on and what was the best angle to take certain pictures. And as Glenda listened to Charles, she just smiled to herself because it was like no matter how many times Charles got shot down by the Hungry Horse News, she knew he was never going to give up. And so she loved his determination and just unflappable attitude about his craft. At around 11 a.m., Charles and Glenda pulled off the highway and began heading towards the trailhead where they would start their hike that day, which was located at the base of Elk Mountain on the southern border of the park. The route they had chosen for that day was not one of the most popular at the park. And the reason for that was the trail was really steep, and in certain parts of it, it was fairly overgrown. And so really only the most hardcore hikers would go up this trail, of which there weren't that many. And so Charles and Glenda were used to being on this trail and seeing no one. But they preferred it that way. They loved being alone out in nature. Finally, they reached the gravel parking lot right at the trailhead, and Charles parked their car, and then he and Glenda hopped out. They grabbed their bags and then began walking on this trail. The first mile of this trail brought the couple out along an abandoned road and then over some railroad tracks and then out into this beautiful field full of white flowers. And then the trail really started to get difficult because it basically went straight up the side of a mountain. And as they walked up this really steep part of the trail, Charles was nonstop taking pictures of everything he saw. There were deer and mountain goats, and at some point the couple reached a clearing on this steep section where they could look down and see a lake, and they saw there were beavers hard at work building a dam. And so, of course, Charles got a picture of that too. Now, these were the days before digital photography, and so all these pictures that Charles was taking, he couldn't actually see. He needed to go home and develop the film to see if anything he took was worth keeping. But as Charles and Glenda continued their hike up this mountain, Charles was getting more and more excited about some of the shots he was getting. He felt like they were going to be really, really good, and Hungry Horse News was going to finally accept his work. The couple made it to the summit of this trail by early afternoon, and from up there, they had this beautiful panoramic view of all these jagged mountaintops that were covered in snow, separated by these huge valleys and prairies. And Charles and Glenda were the only ones up there, and so they had this unbelievable view all to themselves. And so the couple would eat the lunch that they brought with them while sitting on this rocky outcropping, kind of looking out over this stunning view. And then when they were done, they packed up their stuff and began heading back down, because they knew they wanted to get off of this trail and out of the park before sundown. It was just about 5 p.m. when Charles and Glenda had reached the final slope of this steep section of the trail, and they were getting closer and closer to that big open field with the white flowers. And as they're going down this last section of steepness, Charles suddenly grabs Glenda and stops her and puts his fingers to his lips and then turns around and points behind him. Charles was visibly excited about whatever he was pointing at, but when Glenda looked in the direction he was pointing, she couldn't see anything, but she obviously knew that whatever he was pointing at, Charles wanted to take a picture of it. Now, Glenda, by this point, was really tired from the hiking and just wanted to go back to the car and go home. I mean, after all, Charles had taken dozens and dozens of pictures that day. Like, we don't need to get one more. And so Glenda would look at Charles impatiently, basically suggesting, like, come on, we can come back another time. But Charles didn't budge, and he looked at her like, please, I want to get one more photo. And so Glenda kind of did one of these and was like, okay. And Charles said, thank you, I'll meet you at the car. And so Glenda stood there and watched as her husband got his camera out, turned around, and began slowly making his way back up the trail. And again, Glenda's looking. She can't see what he's going to take a picture of, but she figured, he had his plan. And Glenda, she turned around and began heading back down towards the car. It didn't take long for Glenda to get back to the car. She got there right around 6 p.m. And when she got there, she hopped inside, sat in the front passenger seat, turned on the radio, and then she expected to have to wait for maybe another 20 minutes or so for Charles to finish up and come join her. But Glenda, after sitting in the car, was so tired that she accidentally fell asleep. And when she woke up again, she was kind of disoriented, and immediately she looked to see if her husband was in the car with her, and he wasn't. And she's looking outside. It's getting pretty dark out. She glanced at her watch. It was 7 p.m., which means Charles had left her for at least an hour by this point. And she's thinking, there's no way Charles would have been gone for an hour. He would never do that. He would never leave me alone like that. And so Glenda began glancing around her, kind of half expecting to see Charles just outside of their car, doing something, but she was all alone. There was no other hikers or cars. Charles wasn't there. And so starting to panic, Glenda got out of her car and began hustling back onto the trail to go look for Charles. And so she's yelling for Charles. She's looking around. It's getting darker and darker, and there's no sign of Charles. He's not calling back to her. It's just totally silent. So she walks along the abandoned road. She reaches the railroad tracks. She gets into that meadow with the white flowers, and still there's no sign of Charles. And she gets to the base of that steep section of the trail, and she's looking up at all these trees and how dark it was getting. And she's thinking to herself, if Charles is in trouble somewhere up there, there's no way I can help him by myself in the dark with no equipment. No one knows I'm here. I mean, this is an emergency and I need help. And so Glenda would scream a few more times for Charles, and after not hearing any response, she turned and ran all the way back to her car. She turned it on and she drove to the nearest ranger station. When she got there, she ran inside and immediately told the ranger where her and Charles had been, which trail they were on, and where roughly they were on this trail when she had gone to the car and Charles had turned around and gone uphill to take a picture of something. And as Glenda told the ranger all these details about where they were inside of the park, he really started to look worried. And when Glenda was done explaining, he told her that, yes, we need to go right now and look for your husband, but I can't have you on that trail. It's too dangerous. And so this ranger had Glenda wait at the ranger station, and the ranger, by himself, headed back to the trailhead to go looking for Charles. And so the ranger, he gets to the trailhead, he hops out, he's got a rifle and a flashlight, and he begins walking along this trail, and by now, it's dark out. And so he's looking straight ahead with his flashlight and scanning side to side. He's calling out for Charles, and he's walking this trail. He gets all the way across the train tracks, through the meadow, and he gets to the steep section, and he actually begins going up this part of the trail until roughly the area where Glenda had described Charles going one way and her going back down. And when he got there, there was no sign of Charles, and so the ranger just took his rifle and fired 3 shots into the air, hoping that that might get Charles, if he was in the area, to hear him and call out or do something to indicate where he had gone. But after firing his gun, the ranger heard nothing. By this point, it was approaching midnight, it was totally pitch black outside, and the ranger knew that at this point, Charles was missing, and they really needed to organize a true search party to try to find him. But they would have to do that the next morning when they had light again. And so the ranger called out a few more times for Charles, and after not hearing anything, he reluctantly turned around and made his way back to his truck and drove back to the ranger station, where he would tell Glenda that he could not find her husband and they would now have to wait for sunrise. At sunrise the next morning, 20 searchers arrived at the trailhead where Charles and Glenda had been, and these searchers had dogs, and all the dogs had Charles's scent from some clothes that was in Glenda's car. And so this big search team very slowly and methodically began moving down this trail. And so they went across the abandoned road, over the train tracks, through the meadow with the white flowers. They got to the steep section of the trail, and they got all the way up to that point where Charles and Glenda had separated, and Charles had gone uphill to do whatever he was going to do. And it was at that point on the steep section that one of the searchers' dogs picked up Charles's scent and took off running uphill. And the searcher, whose dog this was, took off running after the dog. And the dog, it went up for a little while, up the steep rocky outcropping, and then it turned and began going down again until it reached a different meadow. So not the same one they walked through with the white flowers. This was farther away to the right. And in this meadow, the dog, who still very much had the scent, began to slow down, and it went straight for this tree. It was kind of a standalone tree right at the base of this steep section. And this tree had low hanging branches, maybe 5 feet off the ground. and the dog went right up to the tree, and then it stopped for a second, and the searcher by this point had caught up to the dog, and so he's looking at this tree, and he sees the ground looks really disturbed, and there's deep gouges in this tree, and then the dog went around this tree and sprinted another 50 feet or so, and then stopped, like it had found something. And when the searcher caught up to his dog, he looked down and he found what they feared the most. It was Charles, and he was deceased. His body was totally mangled, his arms and legs were eaten away, there were deep cuts and gouges all over his body, and there was a blood trail from Charles all the way back to this tree. Also, just a few feet from Charles's outstretched hand was a camera, Charles's camera. Now, it was obvious that something horrific had happened to Charles, and there were clear signs of a struggle that took place near this tree, and then also over here where he was found, there were clear marks on the ground that there was some sort of fight that happened right here. But interestingly, Charles was carrying a gun, but it appeared that he did not unholster it and he didn't fire it. Instead, it almost looked like whatever was happening to Charles, he refused to put his camera down, which is why it was so close to his hand when he finally died. And so it was decided that the only way to determine what happened to Charles would be to develop his camera, to figure out what he was taking pictures of before he died. And so authorities would send off Charles's camera roll to be developed, and 2 weeks later, when they got it back, they couldn't believe what they saw. The photos very clearly told the story of what happened to Charles. This is what happened after Charles left his wife on that trail. When Charles stopped his wife and signaled to her that he wanted to take one more picture up the trail, he had found a photographic opportunity of a lifetime. The warm spring weather that had drawn Charles and Glenda out of their house to Glacier National Park had also woken the grizzly bears in the park from their hibernation. And what Charles had seen up the trail was a mother grizzly bear and her 3 cubs. The first few photographs that Charles would take of these bears were shot from a good distance away, and it just showed the mother bear and her 3 babies just kind of sauntering around the rocks, not really paying any attention to Charles. To Charles, grizzly bears were the most majestic creatures in nature. He didn't just love them, he viewed them as if they were sort of magical in some way. He was always going to local town meetings to speak about grizzly bears' beauty, and we needed to defend their natural habitat. As such, anyone who knew Charles knew about his passion for grizzlies. And while of course Charles knew that grizzly bears were dangerous, he also thought that the bears, who were very smart and sensitive, could sense his own very gentle and protective feelings towards them, and so if he was around them, they would never perceive him as a threat. Charles had taken some very good photos of other bears, black bears, but he had never taken what he called the definitive grizzly bear photo. And it was going to be this definitive grizzly photo of the mother and her 3 cubs that would finally get him a spot in the Hungry Horse News publication. As Charles took more and more photos of these bears, you could see in the photos that Charles was getting closer and closer and closer to this mother bear and her cubs. It was obvious that he was tracking them, even as the mother bear and the cubs were clearly trying to walk away from him. Finally, when Charles got about 50 feet away from this family of grizzly bears, he must have kicked a rock or stepped on a twig that broke that startled the bears. And so the second to last photo that Charles would take of this family shows the mother bear very clearly turning around to look at Charles, and she's making perfect eye contact with him, as is one of her cubs. Charles would take one more photo, and in this photo, you can see the bears are not just staring at Charles, they are running towards him. They are charging him. And it was likely after taking this photo that Charles realized the danger he was in. At this point, Charles tried to make a run for it by running down the side of this mountain. He got down to that tree with the low-hanging limbs, and he attempted to climb up into it, maybe hoping he could get one more picture of this bear if they would just leave him alone. But the mother bear and her cubs, they came charging down. They saw him up in the tree, and the mother bear began climbing into the tree, and she reached Charles. Now, she likely weighed about 400 pounds, and when mother grizzly bears are defending their young, they are absolutely merciless. And so she must have grabbed him or bit onto him and yanked him from the tree. And Charles somehow, after being pulled to the ground and getting slashed and bit by this bear, he managed to break away from her, as we can tell from the blood trail, and he made it about 50 feet away from this tree before the bear chased him down again, jumped on top of him, and killed him. When authorities figured out that Charles had managed to briefly get away from this mother grizzly bear and made it 50 feet away from her, they wondered why he hadn't pulled out his gun and shot at the bears to defend himself. But Charles's wife, Glenda, said it made perfect sense that Charles had not tried to harm this grizzly bear or her cubs. He loved grizzly bears, and he would never dream of leaving these 3 cubs without their mother. After Charles's death, the Rangers did not attempt to track down this bear and her cubs and do anything to the bears because they felt like the bears were just acting like bears and it was Charles who was in the wrong. And Charles's family and friends would say that is a decision that Charles would definitely support. Charles's photos of the grizzly bear family were published in the Hungry Horse News alongside an article about his death.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Run Fool.